Okay. Well, welcome everyone. Heather's a bit under the weather, which is why I'm filling in for her today, and we're going to do the RPA session today. It will be pretty basic for because it's designed for new agents primarily. So those of you like Parmita and Rebecca who have filled out RPAs in the past and been through agency disclosure courses and blah, 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 may find this repetitive, but that's okay too. Since you're experienced, I'd expect you to chime in with intelligent questions and additional comments if I overlook something. So I welcome you to do that. So pretty much I'm going to be on share screen on the RPA package. So just speak up if you have a question as we go along, because I'm not sure I'll be able to see your raised hand or such if we're on share screen. Okay. So to get through this, she said A to Z. I would cover A to Z. That's a big order because this is a lot of information in the RPA package, let alone the RPA itself. So we're started at the top here because the RPA package, when you upload it in zip forms, and follow along if you want. On your own computer with your zip forms, if you can do that, I don't know. But anyway, it comes up like this, and it's bundled. The RPA is bundled with a number of other documents that are essential to have when you are filling out an RPA. And the number one essential document in our business really is this disclosure regarding real estate agency relationships, called the AD. It is, I like to train this as like a 30-second form. It's a requirement that we present this to our clients, either our sellers or our buyers, prior to their executing any other documents. And I think the language is to be presented as early as possible in our relationship with the client. It's a statutory form. You can see it says right here, as required by the Civil Code. So this isn't something that's optional. The state laws say we need to provide this, and we need to provide it before anything else. And it talks about that a real estate agent can be a seller's agent. That means we represent a seller. Obviously, we can be a buyer's agent, or we can be an agent representing both the buyer and seller, which is called a dual agent. And it spells out the duties in each case. When we're a specific seller's agent, we have the duty of diligent exercise, reasonable skill and care, a duty of honest and fair dealing, a duty to disclose all facts known to the agent materially affecting the value or desirability of the property. And the same thing, representing a buyer, same duties. And when we're representing a buyer and seller, we have those other duties that are spelled out above, plus a fiduciary duty of utmost care, integrity, honesty, and loyalty in the dealings with either buyer or seller. And the fiduciary duty is like the highest duty one could have. I can compare it to being the trust for your best friend's child and their childhood trust, or serving on the hospital board or something. It's a very high level of it's the highest level of duty that we could have to our clients. So we have to explain this form. We're supposed to verbally explain it and not just send it in a zip form. we're supposed to verbally explain it. That's part of the code, is that we would verbally explain the agency relationships. And to break this down so it doesn't take up our whole time when we're going over an RPA with a client, I usually say this form is required by the Civil Code. It expresses that I could be a seller's agent only, I could be a buyer's agent only, or I could be a dual agent. That's representing both buyer and seller. And this form runs not just to me as an agent, but also to my broker. So I could start out as a seller's agent, being the listing agent. And then I could end up being a dual agent because another agent in our brokerage brings in the buyer. And therefore my duty changes, and it gets added to this fiduciary duty gets added to my duty because I'm now representing both buyer and seller. These are the different forms of agency we can have with buyers and sellers. And then the seller and buyer have certain responsibilities of their own. We ask you to read this form carefully and then sign once you've understood it. Ask any questions you have, go ahead and sign it. Of course, we would fill it out here. The agent's name goes here, agent A, and the agent's DRE number goes there. And then the agent can sign this on behalf of the brokerage. So you agent would go ahead and sign that for the brokerage, and then but you would put the brokerage number here, which isn't in my drop down. But if you set up a template or do this once, it'll give you the drop down for the broker's license. Yeah, there's the broker's license. So that's actually goes down below here. So that's the agency form. Then on page 2 is the actual law that's in the Civil Code. So if you never read this in its entirety, be sure to read it, and then ask me or Randy or any other experienced agent any questions you might have about it. Okay. Any questions now on that? Okay, move on. This is the second form attached here, is the Fair Housing and Discrimination Advisory. This is a relatively new form, and it spells out all the ways we might discriminate against someone, and all the ways we obviously shouldn't discriminate against someone. So these list all these different types of potential discrimination, and it says we're not going to do any of these. We're required again by law to give this out, and it has prohibitions, plus it has examples of positive practices, has resources we can go to for additional fair housing information. There's very limited exceptions to the fair housing law. And then the buyer and or seller, if we're representing the buyer signs this. If we're representing the seller signs it. And we don't need to get, for representing the buyer, we don't need to get one signed by the seller. That's up to the listing agent. Representing the seller, we don't need to get one for the buyer. That's up to the buyer's agent. Okay. So again, we give this to our clients, say, please look over the Fair Housing Discrimination Advisory and let us know if you have any questions. And again, if you've never read this from top to bottom, go ahead and read it all, and then ask us any questions you might have. The third form that's attached here is called the possible representation of more than one buyer or seller, disclosure and consent. Just to give you a little background on this, this form was developed by CAR, our lobbying group. They look after us by developing forms that help us stay safe and from a legal point of view. But there was a legal case that came down, I want to say 20 years ago, that prompted CAR to create this form, and we get it in all our transactions now. And what the case was actually, and it was in 2005, 4 or 5, because it was in the very hot market back then when there were a lot of multiple offers and overbidding for properties, much like we had in the past during the pandemic years here, 2020, 21. But back in 2005, there was a large Coldwell Banker office in San Francisco. And the Coldwell Banker had listed the property, an agent had listed the property, put it on the market. And they happened to be in the office at, it was a large office, and they resided, their office space was at one end of the building. And then there were multiple offers on the property. It so happened that one of the multiple offers was written by someone in that same Coldwell Banker office, but at the other end of the building. So they never really talked to each other about it. They just kind of submitted the offer along with other people from other agencies and so forth. And it turns out that another broker, another agent from outside Coldwell Banker was a successful bidder for the property, and they bought the property. But what happens was that buyer that was being represented by the selling agent at the Coldwell Banker office found out that his offer was presented, but there was a competing offer from another Coldwell. I'm sorry, and part of it was that the successful offer was also from a Coldwell Banker office, but from a different one. So the buyer who was unsuccessful found out that the successful buyer was also from a Coldwell Banker agent, and they filed a lawsuit saying, "Hey, you can't represent two parties for the same property because it's unfair competition. You aren't allowed to do that." Well, the law is actually we are allowed to be dual agents, but we have to disclose that, and it wasn't fully disclosed. So now when I list the property, I don't know who's going to be the selling agent, right? I don't know where they're going to come from, but they might come from our own brokerage. So what this form tells you is that there's a possibility that our firm could represent more than one buyer or seller, and we're telling you about that. So it talks about multiple buyers, multiple sellers, dual agency, and then this last little bit, which is not well known among people, is that offers are not necessarily confidential. The buyer is advised that the seller or listing agent may disclose the existence, terms, or conditions of a buyer's offer unless all parties in the agent have signed a written confidentiality agreement. So unless there's a confidentiality agreement and you write an offer on a property, the listing agent has full capability to negotiate with other parties, disclosing the terms of your offer, saying, "Hey, if you can beat this offer, you might succeed," in order to get the price to the highest level and the terms to the best level for their seller. So when we give this to the buyer and the buyer says, "Hey, I don't want my offer to be shopped," well, the way you solve that is you do a confidentiality agreement. But anyway, that's what this disclosure is about. It just tells everybody in the transaction that we aren't aware of it right now, but we might be representing more than one buyer or seller in the property. Okay, any questions on that? Okay, the next attached form here is a wire fraud electronic funds advisory, transfer advisory, and it just says, talks about wiring the funds, and be careful not to take directions from someone you don't know in the transaction. So that's pretty straightforward. Then comes the RPA, the California Residential Purchase Agreement. We'll skip over it right now just to finish up with the all other attached forms, and then we'll come back and spend the rest of the time on the RPA. Let's see down here. Okay. All right. The other forms that come behind the RPA are the buyer's investigation advisory. This is where we're telling the buyer, hey, you really should take a close look at the property. We strongly advise to investigate the conditions, suitability of all aspects of the property. Kind of has a CYA clause in here. It says we aren't experts at this. So you got to go out and find experts to analyze the property and things like that. Brokers do not have expertise in all areas and therefore cannot advise on many items such as those listed below. And then it lists these various things that we aren't experts on. So this is a CYA form that cover your ass in case you don't know what CYA is, to protect us in the event a buyer comes back and says, hey, you didn't tell me about this, so you didn't explain this. And says, well, listen, we told you we didn't know anything about that. We didn't know, about the earthquakes and, that the property might be, was more susceptible to an earthquake. We don't know anything about wood destroying pests, So it's to kind of say we didn't do it, kind of. And then this new form is actually an addendum. It's a fair appraisal addendum. And it says it's actually telling everyone that the buyer, the appraiser can't discriminate on any basis, in terms of references those discrimination areas, and they can't amend the appraisal based on these subjective matters. The appraisal has to be unbiased, objective, and not influenced by improper or illegal considerations. So that's a new form. We get that signed. And finally, the California Consumer Privacy Act advisory, disclosure and notice. And it's telling them that, stuff they give us, including sellers giving us photos and things, may end up on websites. They may not be private and so forth and so on. So those are all the forms that are attached to the RPA. Let me just take a pause here, see if anyone's still with us. Oh yeah, we got a few people. Any questions on those ancillary forms before I get into the RPA? Be sure to read them all if you haven't read them. Just pull it up. And with new agents, I say, work with your manager. If I'm your manager, work with me, and we'll assign you a property to write an offer on. And then you write it up to the best of your ability, and then we compare notes. Okay, so that's a good practice. It's always good to practice. All right, so let's go back to the RPA itself. All right. So it starts with the date prepared. This isn't the date of the contract. It's just a reference date. It's the date it's prepared. You might refer to that date if in a counteroffer or another addendums and things like that. But otherwise, it's just a reference date for when you actually prepared the offer. And then you have the buyers. Take out this buyer. Whoops. But you would put in the buyer's legal name. If it is a trust or an LLC like this one is, we'll deal with that, how they sign at the bottom. But if it's a husband and wife, you put both names. If it's a husband, if it's a legally married couple, you would put both names. So that's your buyer. You're putting your buyer there. And then you put in the property, identify it by address, by the city, the county and the zip code, and the assessor's parcel number or numbers. You might have two parcels in one address. You would put in both assessor's parcel numbers. And you find the assessor's parcel numbers in the MLS under the real, what is that, data? That's not real list. Anyway, the data program that gives us the tax information on the properties. And it would be in the listing as well. In the listing, actually you click on it and it pulls up the full tax data information. So that's a good thing. So that's all the information you start with in 1ABC. Two is the confirmation of agency. So what we gave them before was a disclosure of agency, the Form AD. This is the confirmation of agency. Now we know who the other broker is going to be. So we fill out the seller's brokerage firm, which is our own. And then we put in the nature of the that. That we're representing the seller only. If we're well, let's say, because you're writing this up for a buyer. So let's have the seller's brokerage firm be Coldwell Banker. Kicks. And then their number would go in here. You can find their number on the DRE website if you need to. And they're representing the seller only. And then the seller's agent would be the agent's name. Sally, seller's agent. And Sally's license number. And then the buyer's firm would be our firm. What's your don't have Better Homes and Gardens here, but please use the full name, Better Homes and Gardens Wine Country Group. If you happen to be with the Ming Tree, then it would be Better Homes and Gardens Ming Tree. So those are the DBAs. It's actually Better Homes and Gardens Real Estate Wine Country Group. You could use BHGRE Wine Country Group. Just something close enough but don't just put Wine Country Group and don't just put Ming Tree. Put the Better Homes and Gardens in front of it. And make sure you have the right license number and then your name and your license number. So this confirms and we're representing now, you are representing the buyer only. Now, if we had dual agency, then this box would be checked here. Both buyer and seller would be checked in both of them. So it would be check, both. So, but in this case, we're not going to be representing both. We're going to be representing seller and the buyer only. And then it refers to that 2D refers to the potentially competing buyer and sellers, that PRBS form we already talked about. And then number 3 starts to deal with the terms of the purchase and the allocation of costs. So now we get into what we call the grid. And this is new in 2021. This was introduced. It was amended as recently as June of this year. But the grid, in my experience, I think the grid is helpful. It kind of mirrors the information form that we've had for many years that we would fill out just for our own information. So it kind of makes it easier to puts all the input data in one place. And so looking at the grid, you can figure out the transaction, at least the business terms of the transaction, pretty clearly. So it starts with the purchase price. If it's an all cash offer, you would check the all cash. It goes on to B is the close of escrow. And what it's referring to here in the paragraph number, this is the reference number. This is paragraph 3A, 3B, 3C. And this is the paragraph number in the RPA itself that references the stuff we're talking about. So 32A under 3C, it says 32A. That's way at the end of the contract, and it deals with the expiration of the offer and explains what that expiration means. But here we're just saying that the expiration is the default is 3 calendar days after the buyer's signatures or such and such date. And then you could put in a specific date. I saw a contract yesterday that was for 24 hours. So put in tomorrow at 5 p.m. And so that's your expiration. 3D involves the initial deposit. And you would put in a dollar amount. You don't have to put in the percentage. I don't know if it calculates it actually. If you have the purchase price and you put in a number here, whether that actually calculates it, I'm not sure.
It calculates.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca.
That.
So once you have the purchase price and a number here, it'll calculate that percentage. And additional terms. The default is within 3 business days after acceptance by wire transfer. So that deposit will be made within 3 business days after acceptance, and it'll be done by wire transfer. And if, let's say you have an old-fashioned person, they don't do wire transfer and they want to give you a check, you would check this or and put in by check delivered to title company or something like that. And then there's an increased deposit. So just to help you out with what amounts to put in here, it varies from transaction to transaction. The total of D1 and D2, the initial deposit and the increased deposit for residential properties 1 to 4, which is what we're dealing with, that are going to be owner occupied. Most of the time we want to have that combined number equal 3% of the purchase price. So if the purchase price is $1 million, we're going to want that combination of the initial deposit and increased deposit to be 3%, which would be $30,000. And the reason is it ties into liquidated damages, which we'll get to later on in the contract. But I mean, I've seen all kinds of things here. I once represented a buyer who was very wealthy. They were offering, it was a $5 million property. It was listed for $5 million. They wanted to offer $4.5 million. So they were trying to impress the seller and make the offer as clean as possible. So they made their initial deposit $4.5 million, the entire purchase price. And they said, they would put that money in the escrow as soon as it was accepted. So the seller was impressed by that, but it didn't sway them, and they still countered the offer at $4.75, I think it was. But yeah, there could be other reasons you modify, or you have something other than the 3% that goes in here. If there's a loan, you would put in the loan amount here. Again, it'll calculate the percentage. This is fixed rate or initial adjustable rate not to exceed. Be sure to put a number in here. I don't know what the going rate is today. I mean, we've been bumping around 6-7%, I think. And it's important if your buyer's qualified for a 6% loan to make this purchase, you want to put 6% in there and make sure that they get 6%, if they end up, the loan commitment comes out at 7%, then they would have a contingency here where they could potentially cancel the contract. So don't leave that blank. Usually there are 0 points in these loans these days, but there might be 1 or 2% loans. It's deemed over here in other terms, it's deemed to be a conventional loan unless these are checked. Could be an FHA, a VA, could be seller financing, other things there. If it's an FHA or a VA is checked, deliver a list of the lender required repairs within 17 days. That's becomes part of the contract. Down to 3E, paragraph 3E, additional financing. So you might have a first loan, a second loan. You might have a conventional first loan, the seller financing for second loan, typically not, but that allows for those things to be completed if that's happening. Under 3E3, the occupancy type, the default is its primary residence. Other selections are secondary or investment properties. And this is important from a lender's point of view. A lender is going to give you a different rate and qualifications for a primary home versus a secondary home or investment property. And then finally, to complete the math, there's the bounce down payment here. So the difference between the deposits plus the loans subtracted from the purchase price will leave you a balance of down payment that is due at close of escrow. The program will automatically calculate that. And that's the amount the buyer needs to bring in for down payment. In addition, they're going to have closing costs and could be prorated costs of tax credits and things like that. So this is just dealing with the down payment. It doesn't deal with the closing costs and other costs that the buyer will have as they go through the transaction. Any questions on that initial purchase price part? Okay, let's move on then. Paragraph G, seller credit, if any, to buyer. We just had a contract the other day where the buyer was asking for a 3% credit. And it shall be applied, the credit shall be applied to closing costs. When we get to paragraph 5E, you'll see that there's a proviso in there that if this credit exceeds what the lender is willing to allow the buyer to have, so you ask for 6% of the purchase price for closing costs, and closing costs are only 3%, then the buyer doesn't get the rest of that money. The seller gets to keep it. So you should be clear, if you're going to be asking for a credit for the buyer in this paragraph, you should be working closely with the buyer's lender to see what would be allowed under the loan terms. And then additional financing terms, can't think of what that would be right off the top of my head, but that's where you would put it if there are any additional financing terms. Then H, we start to get into verifications of these, different things. So if it's an all cash offer, then attached to the offer is the default is that the verification of all cash is attached to the offer. So you would attach statements from banks or stock accounts or things like that that would indicate that the buyer has enough cash to close on the transaction. Typically, you would kind of take a statement that the buyer would give you and black out the account numbers and things like that. So you just have the buyer's name and the amount. You don't want to be spreading the account numbers all over the place. If you didn't want to attach that to the offer, you could do it, check this box and do it within 3 days after acceptance, or some other number of days. Same thing with the verification of down payment and closing costs. And their default is that they are, some statement is attached showing that the buyer has the down payment and closing costs, or it can be submitted within 3 days. And then verification of loan application is attached to the offer. That's usually where we have a pre-approval letter from the lender that we would attach to the offer, showing that the buyer's made an application and has been pre-approved. There's 3 different things here over on this side. There's the pre-qualification letter, pre-approval letter, and a fully underwritten pre-approval. So obviously the fully underwritten pre-approval is the strongest of these 3 options. That would be where the buyers submitted all of their credit information and employment information, and the lender's done their full underwriting package, and they've sent a pre-approval letter that's already fully underwritten. That would be clear in the lender's letter. The second strongest one would be a pre-approval letter where the buyer is given information to the lender to the extent that they would give you a pre-approval, but they haven't submitted it to underwriting. And then the weakest of these is a pre-qualification letter where the buyers just told the lender, hey, I earned this much and I have this much money down. The buyer hasn't, the lender really hasn't verified any of that, but they'll still write a pre-qualification letter saying, hey, if all this stuff is true that the buyer's telling me is true, then they're pre-qualified. So if you're on the receiving end of one of these verification loan applications, take a look at what kind of letter you're getting and be sure to discuss that with your seller. Now we jump over to the next section, which is J, a final verification of the property. So paragraph 16 deals with that. The default is 5 days prior to close of escrow. You'll do final verification. K deals with assignment of the contract. All contracts are assignable based on the language in paragraph 23. And we'll get that to that shortly. If the buyer is going to ask for the contract to be assigned, the default is that they would do so within 17 days. So that also is covered in paragraph 23. Now we get into the L's, 3L. And these are detailed contingencies and the time to remove the contingencies and the contingency that's already removed. So these are divided up into these 3 columns. So L1 starts with the loan. So they have 17 days as a default to remove the loan contingency. Again, you want to be working closely when you're representing a buyer with the buyer's lender to know if 17 days that's feasible, if they can actually give you a loan approval in 17 days. And if they can't, they say, no, I need 30 days, then you would put 30 in that blank. So you work very closely with the buyer's lender to make sure these things you're representing can be done. Back, I don't know, last year, we were having trouble getting appraisers out on properties. So our lenders told us to put in 30 days instead of 17. I think we're back to a pretty normal cycle, and 17 days is doable, but be sure to check with your specific lender. And if you had no loan contingencies, you would check that box, no loan contingency. Appraisal. Appraisal is a contingency. And the default is that the appraisal will be a minimum of the purchase price. Sometimes on offers that are exceeding the listed price, you might put the listed price in there. So as long as it appraises for the listed price, I'll pay the premium above the appraisal. Things like that. But usually, the default would apply here, and that the appraisal contingency is based on the appraised value being equal to the purchase price. And that's also 17 days. Your lender can tell you whether that's realistic or not. And if your client had no appraisal requirement, they would check this box that there is no appraisal contingency. Okay. L3, investigation of the property. So we'll get into paragraph 8C and 12 deals with investigation of the property and the definition of that. So we'll get to that shortly, but the default is 17 days. Often in a competitive situation, you want to do that a shorter period of time, 10 days, 5 days, depends on what reports you might already have, things like that. So check with your manager if you have any concerns about when you're writing that up. Informational access to the property. So let's say your buyer has removed all contingencies and they just are going to have informational access to the property, then they would also have 17 days to get on the property, even though they have no contingencies. And this is clear here. It says buyer's right to access the property for informational purposes only is not a contingency and does not create cancellation rights. It applies even if the contingencies have been removed. So the buyer still has a right to get information about the property, but that may not be a contingency. Review of seller's documents. It's for L4, again, 17 days. Review of preliminary title report, 17 days. Review of the common interest disclosure, 17 days. Review of leased or liened items, solar panels, PACE loans, et cetera, 17 days. And then L8 is it's contingent upon the sale of buyer's property. We are seeing a little more of that right now. In the past few years, in the past 10 years, we haven't seen many contingent offers. That is an offer contingent upon the buyer selling the property they already own. I think as the market normalizes and becomes kind of a more neutral market in terms of buyers and seller strength, we'll see more buyers wanting to move up. They have plenty of equity in their home. They want to buy a bigger home, but they have to sell their first home before they can do that. So they'll write an offer that is subject to sale of their home, and that would use CAR form COP. COP is a complicated form. I've done trainings on that separately. If you're getting, if you have a buyer who needs to sell their home in order to buy another, don't walk away from that. Write it up and fill out the COP form and see where you can go. Over here under other information or other terms, it deals with the removal or waiver of contingency. Any contingency L1 through L7 may be removed or waived by checking the applicable box above or attaching a contingency removal form, CR form, and checking the applicable box therein. Removal or waiver of time of offer is against agent's advice. Removal, so let's say that again. Removing your contingencies or waiving your contingencies at the time of the offer is against the agent's advice. See paragraph 8H. So we always advise our buyers to get inspections and to have contingencies, so if they find something on the property they don't like, they can cancel. Sometimes the seller has reports the buyer's already seen, and they'll accept those reports and say, okay, I don't need to do any more reports. I like that home inspection. I like that. I understand the pest report, and I'll waive my physical inspections. That doesn't mean they should waive all of their investigations up here, investigations of property, because they have to investigate other things. They have to investigate the insurability of the home. They have to investigate potentially other aspects of the property. When we get to paragraph 8H, we'll see how that is dealt with. But if you're going to waive in your offer some of the contingencies, then the CR form is attached. If you're writing your first offer and you're thinking about the waiving, having the buyer waive or remove their conditions up front, discuss that with your manager so you can fill out the appropriate blanks in the CR form. The CR form is a complicated form also. Paragraph M, or 3M, deals with possession, the time for performance and additional terms. So time of possession talks about the default is the buyer will get possession on the date of recording at 6 p.m. or some other time as specified. And if there's a tenant in occupancy, there would be a TOPA, TOPA. So that would apply if there's a tenant involved. Under paragraph M2, possession of the seller occupied were vacant units. So this might be where the seller is going to occupy the property after close of escrow for some number of days so they can move out. That's not uncommon. Let's take it out of a double negative and say it's fairly common that a seller would want time after close of escrow to stay in the property and get it cleaned up and moved out, all that stuff. If it's under 29 days or fewer, you would use one form. If it's over 30 days, you use another form. It says here on the additional terms, the SIP is attached at 29 days or fewer. The RLAS form is attached at 30 days or more. So it tells you, if you check one of these boxes, it's actually going to add that form to your package. So you'll be able to fill it out along with the RPA. And then the M3 deals with tenant occupied units. And that's all dealt with in the TOPA form. If you were to check this box here, the TOPA, it'll add the TOPA form for you. Not going to get into those ancillary forms today. We'll stick with the RPA. All right, now we got paragraph N, 3N, documents, fees, and compliance. So a seller delivery of documents. The seller is obligated under state law to deliver a transfer disclosure statement, or TDS. And a good listing agent will have the seller prepare that TDS when they take the listing, so it's all ready to give to the buyer at the time they go into contract. The default for time for performance is 7 days. The seller will deliver that. The seller will also typically deliver an SPQ, seller property questionnaire, and an NHD, a natural hazard disclosure. Those are the forms the seller is obligated to deliver. There are certain seller exemptions for those forms, but that's, I won't get into those matters now. But for whatever documents the seller is obligated to deliver, they have 7 days to do so. And 2 deals with the sign and return the escrow holder provisions and instructions. So this RPA contains language in paragraph 19B, which gives the escrow holder instructions. So basically the RPA becomes the base escrow instructions. And seller has 5 days to deliver that. The seller has 3 days to order the HOA docs and pay for any fees therefore. And under N4, Seller must install smoke alarms if they are present, carbon dioxide detectors, and do water heater bracing. They should do that within 7 days after acceptance. And evidence of representative authority 3 days after acceptance. That's dealt with here in paragraph 2B, if 28. We'll see that when we get to it. Okay, items included and excluded. Paragraph P. So you would check everything that's included. The only ones that's pre-checked is bathroom mirrors unless excluded below. So it's automatically included. But the rest of these things you have to check if they're going to be included with the sale. Often the listing will say that washer and dryer are not included. We sometimes get into a problem when the listing says the washer and dryer are not included. The buyers, checks off washer and dryer, and nobody kind of notices it along the way. We get to the end and the washer and dryer are gone, but the buyer's expecting them. We can get into problems there. I always like one of our most experienced agents said to me one time, he says, I don't buy washers and dryers. So, if somehow a screw up happens there, the party may turn around and say, hey, you messed up, buy me a washer dryer. Well, don't, I think what my experienced agent was saying, is don't mess up here. Be sure you're checking what's available. And then if there are excluded items specifically, you would check these boxes and list them. Allocation of costs. So now we have the item described, who's going to pay for it, and any additional terms. So the NHD can be paid. It's an obligation of the seller to deliver it, but it can be paid for the buyer or seller, but typically it's paid by the seller. And then other reports that are just, you could name here. That, we typically don't want to put in a pest report, even though the buyer may be going to get one, because the lender doesn't want to know that there's a pest report necessarily. Because if the lender sees in the contract that there's a pest report, then they're going to ask for the pest report, and they may ask for certain work to be done that the parties weren't going to do. So don't list a pest report, don't list a home inspection here, even though the buyer may be willing to do those. If the seller's already got them, you could click those because the seller's already provided them. Smoke alarms, these are required that the seller provide them, but he can, it's negotiable about who pays for them. Government required point of sale inspections and reports. Sometimes some communities, I think Cotati is the only one in Sonoma County. There are other areas that they require, the city requires an inspection report at the point of sale. And again, typically the seller would pay for that, but it's negotiable. Government required point of sale corrective or remedial actions would be that, okay, you get this inspection report and says, hey, you need to correct this thing before the sale can close. And it's optional about who's going to pay for those. Typically, we're going to say the seller's going to pay for those. Okay. Escrow fees. In our market, it's typical the buyer's going to pay for the escrow fees. In Southern California, it's typical the seller's going to pay for escrow fees. So it varies from market to market. It's negotiable. Sometimes you would say each pay their own fees, because some of the escrow fees are related to buyers, some are the seller. You might split it 50-50. So, but in our marketplace up here in Northern California, typically the buyer is going to pay that. The owner's title insurance, typically the buyer is going to pay that. Again, it's negotiable. um, often and you could, under other terms here, you could put in the name of the escrow holder, where you're going to open the escrow. The buyer has the right to open the escrow with the company they want to. And the title company and the escrow company are actually two separate things. But the title company does the prelim and does the title insurance. The escrow company handles the escrow. In our marketplace, those companies are usually combined. First American Title does both the escrow and the title insurance. Fidelity Title the same way. And the other title companies up here in Northern California. And in Southern California, they're very often different names for the escrow holder and the title company. So it's common up here that a seller might open up, a listing agent might open up an escrow with their favorite escrow company because they want to be on good terms with their escrow company and do their favorite escrow officer a favor. Again, the buyer has the right to choose their own, and even though the seller maybe shows in the listing that they've opened up or pre-opened an escrow, that's not necessarily where it has to go. So that is negotiable as well. Under Q9, we get the buyer's lender title insurance. That's always going to be paid by the buyer because it's for the lender, the buyer's lender. So any title insurance that the lender requires, the buyer is going to pay for it. County transfer tax, again, typically throughout the state here, the seller pays for that. City transfer tax, I'm not aware that there's most cities transfer tax are bundled into the county transfer tax. And I'm not aware of a separate city transfer tax in our communities. Under Q12, HOA fee, preparing disclosures is typically the seller, unless otherwise agreed. HO certification fee, be the buyer. Not sure what that is. Q14, HO transfer fee is negotiable, but we would typically say the seller's going to do that. Private transfer fees, I don't recall ever seeing into those. And other fees or costs could be listed here. Finally, under Q18, there's a home warranty plan. The buyer may pay for it, the seller may pay for it. The buyer, if the buyer's not going to get a home warranty, we want you to check here that the buyer is waiving the home warranty because our E&O insurance gives us a deduction in our deductible, a reduction in our deductible if the buyer's gotten a home warranty or if they've signed a waiver that they're not getting a home warranty. So that could help us down the road if we happen to get into some kind of legal mess and we need to rely on our E&O insurance or emissions insurance. It's a good thing that buyer have a plan either provided by the seller or someone else, or the buyer waives. Often the buyer's agent may pay for that to give their client a home warranty. You would want to put in the cost not to exceed some number there. But that's not a requirement at all. It's just a goodwill offer on behalf that many buyers do, buyer's agents do for the buyers. And then any other terms you might have get filled out here. Can't think of any off the top of my head, but there could be other terms that you want to put in this paragraph 3R. Okay, that's the grid. Those are the business points of our transaction. We just take a quick break and see if anyone has a question on the grid.
Gary, I had a question on, I think it was Q5? Q5.
Okay.
where it said government. Sorry, I'm trying to find the paragraph now. It's on page, yeah.
Q5.
Yes, Q5 and 6. Years ago, I was told by another agent to never fill this in. But you're saying we should put something.
Well, if we know
Uh-huh.
that there are no government required point of sale inspections or reports, then you could leave that blank.
Okay.
And-
What kind of, because I've never come across any. What would be an example of one?
I know San Rafael in Marin County has always had required an inspection, and they do require corrective actions if they find something that's amiss.
Okay.
So, and I think Cotati, has anyone sold property in Cotati?
Not for a few years.
Yeah, I think Cotati is the only community in Sonoma County that has a point of sale report or inspection. So if you're, otherwise, I think we're safe to leave those two forms blank in our territories and that we cover. If you're working in an area that you aren't sure, you can make a quick phone call to the city. Say,
Okay.
hey, are there any requirements regarding reports or inspections at the point of sale? And,
Okay. Thank you.
yeah, Rebecca, you have an answer there?
No, I have a question. Since you're on this part of the page, for Q7 and Q8,
Yes,
under the where it's got a line for escrow holder and title.
yes.
Do we just put the company there, or do we have to put the agent's name on
No,
there?
just a company, let me see if I have any drop down. Yeah. So
Okay.
they've got all these in the drop down, actually. So, whatever's in your area that you like to choose, just put the company name.
Okay. I think it only comes up in the drop down if you've entered it into a form before. It like remembers the ones that you put in there.
I can't remember ever ordering Mid Valley title in my.
Oh, okay.
So I think that's a regional kind of, it may be a California regional thing.
So to further answer anyways, if we've already opened escrow, if or the other side has already opened escrow with somebody, there's a spot, it's towards the end of the RPA, and like the closing sections, like
Uh-huh.
third from the last page, where you have the agent information again, like alternate contact and stuff. And underneath that section is another area for escrow and title. Do we put the title agent's name down there, or do we just not put it anywhere on the RPA?
Well, obviously you're gonna fill it out here if
Right.
you know where you're going to open title. Now, most buyers don't have a preference. Say, I don't know who the good escrow company is or a good title insurance company is.
Yeah.
And then you would say, well, I've had my personal experience. This is one place where you can share personal experience and say, in my personal experience, I've worked with Sally over at First American Title, and she's always done a great job. And they're a well-known title company here. And if you don't have a preference, we can work with Sally because she's always done a good job for me. So that's fair to say something like that. We aren't going to get.
But you don't have to put it anywhere specifically into the RPA if a specific agent's been requested.
If let's just go down there real quick. All right, yeah, you're talking about here. So since I already filled in fidelity up there above, it's already downloaded it here. Now, this is, we're on page 16, the last page of the contract now. It says escrow holder acknowledgement. if you don't have this information, you don't fill it out. If the seller agent has opened it up an escrow and you have that number and your buyer is willing to, go to that title company, there's no reason potentially not to. Unless you've had a bad experience with that company, you would say, hey, I've had a bad experience with that company. I really recommend we go to a different company. And then you would have to call that agent and say, that listing agent, say, hey, my buyer wants to use a different title company. And all the first title company would do is close that escrow that they open. I think it's not a practice we used to do that's being done now, where we pre-open escrows as a listing agent. I think the title companies maybe have encouraged us to do that, so that they get the business, or we want to support our local favorite escrow officer. So
I feel like I see it about half the time on a listing
Yeah.
on MLS that escrow has already been opened with such and such
Yeah.
agent and company.
right. And I don't know if we open a title and escrow company, we might encourage you to put in our company. I don't know, but for now, if that's already in there, then discuss it with your buyer and see how you want to proceed.
Thank
And
you.
if you were willing to, if the buyer is willing to accept the escrow officer and company that's the selling agent's already selected, then go ahead with that. And put it in that form there. Yeah. All right. So I got about 20 minutes left here. And we have about 30 paragraphs to cover. So this could be a pretty quick run through here. Paragraph 4 deals with property addenda and advisories. There's a significant difference between an addenda and an advisory. An addenda is an addendum that's attached to the contract, and that becomes a legal document that's an extension, basically, of the contract. Now, the way they've changed these forms, we use the RPA for probate sales, and we just attach the probate addendum. We use the RPA for manufactured home sales, and we attach the manufactured home addendum. So that's become kind of easy. If the tenant occupied property, we attach the TOPA. If it's a tenancy in common purchase, a TIC, we attach the TIC form, and so forth. So those would be addendum. We typically don't have any there of this bunch, but you might. And then under 4 are other addenda. And there might be one where you're just writing up separate language because you didn't have room in the base contract. And then you would attach addendum number 1, kind of thing. And if you were a backup offer, you'd attach a backup offer. And then there's other types of addendums that you would attach if it applied. And buyer intent to exchange, short sales, court confirmation, addendum, seller intent to exchange, all those sorts of things. And then there's advisories, and these aren't contractual, they're just advisories. The ones that are pre-checked are already attached, and we've already gone over the buyer's investigation, wire fraud, fair housing, privacy. Then there's others that are going to be attached when they apply. The wildfire disaster advisory. I think in our area, we're always going to be attaching that. Even if you're in the town of Sonoma here, we're in a wildfire disaster area. Trust advisory, if there's a trust. If it's an REO, you would attach an REO. We prefer that you attach the statewide buyer and seller advisory because that has lots of those CYA clauses that help us in the event we get in, there's a dispute somewhere down the road. If it's a short sale, and we do see some short sales now and then still, then you would attach this information and advisory. And it's a probate, you would attach the probate advisory. Okay. And then these are the referenced paragraphs that were referenced above in the grid. So the initial deposit, and it refers back to the grid, 3D1. That's where it talks about the initial deposit. The increased deposit, it refers back to 3D2. That's where it talks about that. Retention of deposit. So if paragraph 29 is initial, that's the liquidated damages paragraph. And then this is an advisory about that. Who gets to retain the deposit in the event of a cancellation. So that's an important thing to know. We'll get to that when we get to paragraph 29. All cash offer gets explained if it's a paragraph 3A is checked. And it also refers to the 3H1 that there's no loan within the time specified in 3H1. And then loans, it talks about first loans, additional financing, buyer loan status, FHA loan, talks about the balance of the purchase price as referenced in paragraph 3F. Limits on credits. This is that one we talked to about that you don't ask for a credit in excess of what the lender will allow, because it says here that the seller can reduce the credit they have to give if the lender will allow it, so the buyer doesn't get all the money they bargained for. That's not a good situation. So again, it's important you read through all these paragraphs, and to the extent they have any questions, take out a yellow pad, write down your questions, and then let's go over them. Call me, call Randy, call somebody Heather, someone you can rely on. And then there's a verification of down payment and closing costs, as referenced there, buyer stated financing, just talks about the type of loan the buyer is getting and what they're representing. And then the closing in possession. So again, all refers back to the grid 3E3. It says the buyer is going to occupy. Condition of property. Here we see one of our first references of again that we're strongly advised the buyer to conduct investigations of the entire property. The seller's remaining in possession after close of escrow. That's where we got that COP form. I'm sorry, the what was it? The seller in possession, the SIP form. And it talks about different things that are going to happen at closing there. Contingencies and removal of contingencies. Here it talks about removing the loan contingency. And be sure when you're removing a loan contingency for your buyer, it's fully committed. And that it can't be pulled by the lender for some reason. It has to go to secondary underwriting or something like that. Make sure before you remove that contingency. Appraisals, investigation of the property. Again, there's a big distinction between investigations and inspections. You might waive your inspections of the physical property, but you still have the right to do investigations. So be sure to read this language and make sure you understand it. And it talks about the title of the property. The buyer is going to review a preliminary report. We had a transaction recently where a revised preliminary report was issued. And that really opened up the preliminary report contingency again, because it had a new item in it that the buyer had to agree to accept. Talks about condominiums, planned unit developments, leased or liened items. Here, if you're going to remove a waiver of contingency, unless the seller, buyers have no obligation to remove a contractual contingency unless the seller has provided all the required documents relating to that removal. We don't recommend removal of contingencies with offers, but it happens. And then it talks about cancellations, if in the event of what the rights of cancellation are, if a contingency has been removed or not removed. The sale of the buyer's property, we talked about in the COP form. And then items included and excluded from the sale. It gets into a lot of detail about those items. So read and understand that. Talks about the items excluded, and then it goes into the allocation of costs. So you can see how this is following the grid down. It's a very logical process. It refers back to the grid here, 3Q, 1, 2, 3, and 5 only determines who is to pay for the tests. Does not determine who's to pay for any work recommended by those reports. Those will be covered in the RR, the request for repairs, or the RRR, or an ADM, or an AEA. So yeah, it makes it clear that those prior paragraphs are just talking about the cost of getting the report, not to remedy any problems found in the reports. Here we're talking about the government stuff, the point of sale requirements and point of sale inspections, home warranty, a dark language here. I mean, highlighted language. If buyer waives the purchase of the home warranty, buyer may still purchase the home warranty prior to the close of escrow. So you might waive it at the time you write the contract, but still get it before close of escrow. And then the statutory and other disclosures, talks about this TDS, NHD, and other statutory requirements that we talked about. Lead disclosures. This is newly added just this month, last month, the home fire hardening disclosure. Tune in on Friday, 11 o'clock. We're going to have a detailed training on the HFDS with Bill Jansen. It's illegal to waive some of these disclosures that are statutorily required. You can't waive getting them. Returning signed copies, termination rights. So remember, the TDS has a 3-day right of termination if it's delivered in person, 5 days delivery if it's deposited by mail or electronic email. So we've had that come up. The seller, the buyer, elected to cancel 4 days after they received the TDS by email, and they didn't like what was in the TDS. And the party came back and say, "Oh, you only had 3 days." And I said, "No, you have 4 days. You actually have 5 days if it's email." Withholding taxes, that has to do with sellers necessarily having taxes withheld under certain circumstances. Megan's Law. There's a database where people can find out where sex offenders are living. If they're living near the house and the buyer is buying, they may not want to buy the house. But we don't provide this database. The contract tells them where to go if they're interested in finding out. So that we don't become Megan's Law determiners or anything like that. Never had this gas or liquid gas transmission lines come up. I don't know what that's about. In condominium plan unit developments, be sure you have the documents reviewed by your client. I think it was, might have been Barmida had a transaction a while ago where the homeowners association had let their insurance, property insurance lapse for all the units. And we couldn't close the transaction until the homeowners association got new insurance. They were arguing about what type of insurance to get, but in the meantime, we had to wait. There's other natural environmental hazards. Then 12 is investigation of the property. This is an important paragraph. What the buyer should be investigating. This is everything they should be doing. Talks about getting into the property, and the buyer can't, damage the property when they're inspecting it, things like that. Title investing. How does a buyer want to take title? What requirements around that, options around that, the different types of title insurance that one might get. Then the always important paragraph 14, which talks about the time periods for these different things that are going to happen. You see this refers back to other paragraphs. The seller is going to deliver under all these different documents under those paragraphs. It refers back to the 3L3 and so forth, where the actual time was specified. And then rights to cancel. The seller has certain rights to cancel, and the buyer's right to cancel. The buyer has certain rights to cancel. You need to read and understand those. They can be complicated. Notice to buyer or seller to perform. The contract provides that a notice to perform be delivered. If there's a demand to close escrow down there under 14G here, that's a form that needs to be delivered. When we used to do paper forms, we had those particular forms were had a red label and says, "Do not use this form unless you talk to your manager," because to give someone a notice to perform is kind of a real kind of big step. So we still like for you to discuss that with us before you write one up. And if you get one, certainly call us and we can talk about the consequences. And it talks about effects of cancellation on deposits, what might happen. Repairs, if any, to be done, final verification of condition, prorations of property taxes and other items. As you know, property taxes are prorated to the date of closings. It talks about broker's compensation, scope of duty. Here's the joint escrow instructions. So it refers all of these details to the escrow company as instructions for them as to how to handle the escrow. Talks about service providers, multiple listing service, attorney's fees and costs. The prevailing party in any dispute is generally under these contract terms is entitled to their attorney fees, which can be quite expensive. Here's the buyer's right to assign the contract and what the restrictions are on that assignment. And then definitions. This may seem rudimentary, but they're important. What's it mean? What is the date of acceptance? Time the offer is fully executing writing of the recipient and delivered the product. So day one of your escrow, if you get accepted today, day one is tomorrow, not today. Those kind of things are defined here. Who's an agent? What's the agreement? As is, what does that mean? Close of escrow, COE. Those are terms the buyer doesn't necessarily understand. Counting of days. So that explains how days are counted. Be sure you read that and understand. Other terms and conditions of the offer. Time is of the essence. You learned that in the your training, your course. Time is always of the essence in real estate transactions. Then you get into liquidated damages. Typically, we're going to advise buyers and sellers to agree to liquidated damages. And that means that if there's a dispute that arises out of the cancellation of the contract, the damages are limited 3% of the purchase price. And that's deemed to be reasonable, and everybody agrees to that. Mediation. Mediation is required if the parties have a dispute after close of escrow. Or the parties may go, the disputing party may go to small claims court if the claim is within the small claim court jurisdiction, which is $10,000. Arbitration of disputes. This is optional. Our position on this is that if our client has a strong opinion about arbitration, then they should follow their instincts. And if they have no opinion about arbitration, we usually say our legal counsel, which is Bill Jansen for these purposes, recommends that you not agree to arbitration at the outset of the transaction because you have the right to do so later, depending on what the dispute is. So arbitration can be just as expensive as going to court. And one drawback is there's no right to an appeal of an arbitration decision. Whereas if you get a bad decision in a court trial, you can appeal that. And we've actually done that in the past. And there's a buyer's offer, the expiration of the offer. If there's an entity, if it's a trust or an LLC or something, you would check this box, fill this form out as it presents itself. It's pretty easy to follow, but if you have any questions and you're filling it out, just give us a call. And then the acceptance offer. This is what part that the seller would fill out, and then if they're doing a seller counter offer, they would check that. The backup offer, if it's going to be a backup offer. If the seller is an entity, they would check that box and sign it as an entity. And then finally, we do like to get this initial, if you have multiple offers, you're a listing agent, and you're going to reject an offer, or let's just say the seller doesn't want to accept that offer, get this initial to send it back. No counter offer being made. The seller has not accepted the offer and put a date. It's just a good practice. And then this is the real estate brokers section. It'll automatically fill your stuff in when you have the stuff filled in above. It just talks about we are not parties to the agreement, but this is just for information only. It puts everybody's contact information, and the escrow company would acknowledge receipt of this if all this escrow information is known, they would send it over. This is something that was added a year or two ago, a presentation of offer. The seller brokerage firm presented this offer on such and such date. The buyer and the buyer's agent have a right to know that the offer was presented. So how do you show them that the offer was presented? You have your seller initial this part of it and fill in the date. Okay. Well, 132. I did pretty good there. I know we breezed through the paragraphs, but that covers the RPA in a quickly broad sense. Any questions arise at the moment? Let's see, comment in the chat. Oh, I have to log off. Right, Bermuda. Okay.
Thanks, Gary.
Okay, everybody got it? Again, if you haven't done one, pick a property, pick your favorite listing, and pretend you have a buyer, write up the offer, and send it over to me, and we'll go over it, okay? Happy to do that. Okay, everybody, that's our class for today. Tune in next week. Heather will be back, and I don't know what her topic is, but if you have any specific questions that arise, just reach out to me, okay? Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Be well. Bye.
Thank you.
You're welcome.